When the bells of King's Landing sang their choked surrender and yet the sky continued to fall as if judgment had mistaken the signal for a summons, a question entered the marrow of the realm more surely than any blade. Whether Daenerys Stormborn, last daughter of Aerys and Rhaella, deserved the end that met her upon the high steps of the ruined Red Keep. And if there is justice in this world of ours, forged in the old god's roots and the Seven's bright halls, it must be justice that can look upon a person entire lineage and wound, oath and deed, mercy offered and mercy refused, and render a verdict that is neither the quick arithmetic of revenge nor the soft forgetfulness of song. Let us then call to account the full measure of her days, for truth in histories is not a balance sheet that tallies only the final outrage or the first kind act, but a long braid of intention, necessity, accident, and the dread momentum of power that begins as a tool in the hand and becomes the hand that wields the tool. Daenerys entered the world in storm and usurpation, a child of a line that learned its craft among the smoking towers of old Valyria and then relearned it in exile and fear. The very palace stones that should have echoed with lullaby and counsel rang instead with the memory of wildfire, whispers, and a father whose mind had fractured along the seam that runs between vision and paranoia. She had no cradle speaker to teach her the lawful give and take of Westerosi lordship, no small folk familiarity to restrain a queen's abstractions with the intimate details of winter grain and levy lists. But she did have a brother who interpreted all the world through humiliation and entitlement and a handful of sell-sale stories in place of a statecraft library. One must not excuse, but one must understand, for beginnings are not bars to lock a fate but are rails that incline it. And the pressure of years makes an angle into a path. Sold as a bride to the horse lord to purchase a crown for another, she learned two lessons before she learned her own sovereignty. First, that power often introduces itself in the grammar of possession, the possessive pronouns of men who consider people a kind of currency, and second, that belonging can transform the body but not the soul, for she who was sold learned to command, and she who trembled learned to speak a word that burned, and between those two movements the future of kings and cities pivoted. It is a commonplace in the Citadel that the most dangerous rulers are those who confuse their wound for their mandate. The wound demands a redressable wrong, the mandate demands a program for the world, and when the two are married they give birth to a politics that sees enemies not as obstinate persons but as embodiments of a crime. Daenerys, who was conquered and then beloved, who was bereaved and then hailed, came to believe that to free is to burn, because in her first empire the fire that devoured the pyre made room for creatures of miracle and allegiance. Her dragons were not only weapons but proof that destiny had nodded in her direction. And when destiny nods, human counsel grows small in the proud ear. The march through Karth and the slow conquest of the Giscari cities proved what she would reward and what she would tolerate. A liberator's mercy to the broken and the powerless, an iron justice to the brutal and the profiting, and, most tellingly, a disposition to perform punishments symbolically, so that a city might feel moral arithmetic through the skin. Astapor received her rhetoric as a lark, and the lark turned to a thunderclap when her language and her legerdemain reversed master and slave in a single noon. Yunkai learned that bargaining with a crusader buys only a postponement of reckoning, and Meereen taught Daenerys the first sharp contrary of her education, that to break chains is not yet to govern a people. For when she came to rule sitting, rather than riding, the contradictions gathered around her as crows. The old houses protesting that a city cannot live in perpetual humiliation. The freedmen insisting that dignity without bread is another name for bondage. Her own conscience recoiling at vengeance in any hand not her own. She crucified a number of masters equal to the children left nailed upon the road. It was a gesture meant to weigh the world with fairness, but the scale she used was calibrated by pain and spectacle, not by close inquiry, and the masters who died included some who held no direct guilt, while other culprits survived behind neighbors' bodies and smiles. This is not to say her heart was not a fertile field for pity. She locked her young dragons when village ashes showed her the price of unruled might and wept for the mother whose son had vanished in smoke. She punished a freedman who murdered a captive against her orders and thereby made enemies among the very people she was sworn to raise into full citizenship, a paradox that marks many reformers. They prove their devotion to impartial law and lose affection by doing so, while the old guard learns to use order's scruples as both shield and spear. She married to pacify Meereen, reopened blood sport to permit a custom she despised, and in both acts continued her slow education in the grim mathematics of peace, which often reads to the conscience as compromise and to the opposing faction as weakness. When the sons of the Harpy drew blood at the pits and Drogon's shadow entered like a god who disdains municipal debate, the queen's instincts carried her again. She leapt to the creature that made and mirrored her greatness and left to her counselors the work of reckoning with consequences that do not yield to fire. What returned from the Dothraki Sea was not only a claimant but a conqueror again, and, in truth, a priestess of a political theology that has few words except vow and flame. The burning of the calls for their predation upon women and for their arrogant laughter proclaimed once mo. Re that tyrannies disintegrate when their tent poles are removed by courage, and yet a rule of ashes is no more self-sustaining than a rule of chains, and the realm that awaited her beyond the narrow sea knew the custom of assemblies, lords temporal, laws that bound, and a populace that has learned to survive by bending to storms rather than standing against them until they snap. The advisors she gathered made their own theology. Restraint is strategy, victories are secured by alliances as much as by arms, symbols are more potent when they make room for other people's symbols to survive. Thus did she break bread with houses long at enmity, entertain the counsel of a woman whose stock in trade was cleverness in defeat, and place herself, for a time, under the claims of a northern cause that had no heraldry a dragon should recognize. At the fields by the Blackwater Rush, when the Lannister Tarly column discovered that the old song of the Field of Fire had found a second verse, Daenerys encountered a moral hinge that will forever fasten her memory to debate. A defeated lord and his son refusing to bend the knee, and a queen who had made non-submission a synonym for tyranny chose to burn them as the embodiment of a principle, that her justice was not the old cruelty merely rebranded, but a new order compelled to show that heritage and stubbornness do not place one above the law of the future. There are those in the Reach who will tell you that in that instant the word liberator curdled into despot. There are those among the freed who will answer that across the sea whole dynasties of tormentors had died at her command and the world had called it good. What made a father and son of belligerent lords more sacred than anonymous rows of chained men? The honest chronicler must write that the difference lay not in the worth of the souls but in the soil beneath their feet. Westeros recognizes in realm force as persuasion, but it calls fire upon kneeling captives a rupture of the social grammar that lets losers live to become citizens again. Daenerys, raised on the plains of bend or burn, read the refusal as defiance against the emancipation of the many, and Westeros read the judgment as a foreign absolutism that does not know what a defeated noble may become. There is a second hinge, narrower and sharper, that turned in the snows and black glass of the long night. When she answered the call of the living against the dead, she staked much of her invincible myth on a cause that could not reward her with crowns or taxes, and that gesture will always stand as a rebuttal to those who would reduce her to appetite alone. She rode into a darkness that mocked both lineage and program, and though the killing of the Night King belongs in the ledger of another, it remains that her armies were not kept in reserve like a banker's hoard, but spent like blood in the service of a humanity she had scarcely begun to rule. Yet even the noblest outlay does not arm a heart against private ruin, and after the snows melted into lamplit courtyards again, Daenerys faced a cascade. Betrayal in council, a whispering campaign about her claim and her blood, the sudden punctuation of a scorpion bolt through a dragon's ribs, and the last beloved friend beheaded as emblem and message upon a city wall. Bereavement breeds a certain clarity, and clarity of that kind is often indistinguishable from monomania. When the bells rang at last, and the Lannister soldiery slung down their blades, Daenerys found herself elevated to a vantage that only a handful of victors discover. In such moments one does not meet the enemy but the mirror. The surrendered city was not a claimant, not a house, not a swordsman with a crest. It was the population as such, and the population had never embraced her, had never broken bread with her in a town square, had never cheered her arrival without calculation. The population was a symbol, and she, who had learned politics through the grammar of symbols, chose to obliterate that symbol so that none might mistake the birth of the new world for a bargain with the old. If madness is the surrender of proportion and justice to private voices, there are arguments to be made that her decision qualifies. But there is another category, more terrible, which is not madness but ideological lucidity divorced from the common claim of human faces. In this second category, the woman at the parapet is not raving but resolved, and her dragon is not a manifestation of a chaotic mind but the perfect instrument of a clarified will. Whether she deserved the word that the city's survivors chose for her is a matter most disputants answer by placing their thumb on the scale. For the small folk who pulled their children out of the soot, the name Mad Queen names the only form of explanation that permits a world to comprehend the senseless. If she did not lose her mind, then we must think that what happened was reasoned, and that is harder to bear. For her partisans, the name permits too easy an absolution for those who opposed her at every turn, who trapped her in delay, who murdered or humiliated her allies, who treated her pledge to liberate as a threat to revenue and habit. Yet the world is older than either simplification, and we must point to the first seeds, because even a dragon-stuffed destiny grows in soil. The Targaryen blood, preserved like a rare tincture through custom that recoils from mixing, has long been said to flip a coin with the gods at each birth. The proverb is less biology than history's hedge against patterns that recur. Great promise burning into paranoid cruelty, tenderness hardened into vindictive austerity, dreams that begin as service and harden into necessity for all. Ares tore out his nails with suspicion long before he ordered wildfire to be stashed beneath the city. Rhaegar read prophecy like a map and walked himself into a romance and a war. Daenerys listened to visions in a house of phantoms and took their symbols for invitations because people born to symbols are trained to mistake their curves for roads. Add to this the pedagogy of exile, where every kindness comes with a hook and every humiliation tilts a heart toward the day of redress. Add to this the experience of liberation by fire, and the intoxicating cheer of the newly freed who believed, often rightly, that only terror could dislodge tradition. Add to this the counsel of men who had survived by cunning telling a conqueror to be patient in a land that misunderstands patience as weakness. And then pour upon this heap the deaths of children who called her mother, of lovers who left for policy, of friends taken as message, and the thud of a second dragon's carcass into the sea beneath bolts designed by a court alchemist whose genius answered to a queen who set her people between herself and law. In such a furnace, the alloy of character can strengthen or warp, and Daenerys's alloy warped along the axis where justice shades into exemplarity. If we call her descent inevitable, we defraud her early choices of their dignity. If we call it unforeseeable, we abandon the duty of history to trace the fine cracks before the shattering blow. The matter of desert, then, must be partitioned according to the ancient triad of fate, choice, and fortune. Fate in our land is not a spell whispered by red priests but the mesh of ancestry and tale into which the newborn is thrown. In that mesh, her thread carried heat and solitude, a taste for the absolute, and the expected jeering of those who measured her in her father's shadow. Choice is the vector by which a person navigates that mesh, sometimes enlarging the net into a cloak of compassion, sometimes wrenching it into a whip. Here Daenerys chose to define enemies not merely as agents of contemporary harm but as inheritors of a structure that had to be raised, and in so choosing she ennobled her cause while endangering every neutral witness to it. Fortune is the god who drinks where he pleases, and fortune made her govern first abroad, where conquest taught her she was a redeemer, then pitch her into a homeland where redemption was a currency already exhausted by a war of thrones. Fortune gave her companions in the north who respected her without love, and vassals in the south who feared her without respect. Fortune placed in her path a man whose blood validated, even accidentally, the old house's instinct to slow, channel, or supplant her, and fortune mounted her upon the black dragon on the day the bells tolled and the sun made visible every soul she would incinerate if she persisted. If desert is measured by the law, she deserved to be resisted after the burning. It is the first obligation of the living to the living that they halt a sovereign who turns annihilation into pedagogy. And the blade that took her heart was not only a lover's grief but a realm's defense. In the ledger of public duty, Jon Snow did not become Brutus but rather a night's watchman one last time, choosing the common weal over closeness, and for such deeds history carves an uncomfortable niche between hero and assassin. If desert is measured by mercy's demands, she deserved what she had already suffered, exile and insult, the loss of nearly all she allowed herself to love. But the gods do not operate a barter house where prior pain pays for later culpability. Every epic teaches anew the painful lesson that victimhood and villainy may thread a single life, and the day they cross is not visible to any but the terrible hindsight of ashes. If desert is measured by that other, older metric, whether a story compels a resolution consistent with its inner vow, then she reached a culmination that was, in tragic logic, fitting. She had sworn not to refurbish the wheel but to break it, and when the wheel was fused into a throne by the breath of her only surviving companion, the symbol confirmed what the conscience could not bear to name: that the instrument of her promise had become its contradiction. and the creature who carried her to triumph was kinder in understanding the trap than any courtier or cousin. The label Mad Queen will linger because peoples must name their traumas, and the easiest names are those that keep the monster in a far room of the mind. Yet the truer name is harder, and it is this, that Daenerys Stormborn, who loved the poor and hated the proud, who learned to govern less well than she learned to conquer, who was trained by intimacy with fire to seek clean solutions to stubborn human knots, believed at last that fear was a form of clarity, and clarity a kind of love, for if she could terrify the world into virtue, she would have redeemed the insult of her life and spared generations to come the lash of masters and the giggle of courtiers. It is a dreadful syllogism, and history knows its cousins. That she embraced it does not render her less human, but more dangerously human. We must therefore answer, did she deserve the end imposed upon her? In a strictly moral sense tied to the deed at the city's annihilation, the blade was justified. In a larger tragic sense, the better world she dreamt of deserved another sovereign, since her soul had been reshaped to a point where victory would always threaten the people it claimed to serve. In the tender sense by which we evaluate the wounded child who once walked a spice road without a friend, she deserved rescue from the narrow corridor that led from vision to vengeance, and our failure to build such corridors for our leaders is among the quiet crimes that never stand trial. So let the record show both her generosities and her furies. The children of Astapor slept free because of her. The masters of Meereen learned that intimidation had met its historian. The armies of men and women not her own were saved for a night from an enemy beyond politics by her audacity. And a capital was charred because she misread surrender as acquiescence to cycles she existed to end. Let it also show that kings before her had torched keeps and fields to bring stubborn vassals to heel, that Aegon himself proved his claim by setting a tyrant's fortress to glow, and that the distinction between terror used to found a lawful peace and terror used to found an unanswerable conscience rests less on methods than on the capacity to stop when the symbol is secured. She did not stop, and so the new realm learned a twofold lesson. That reform without humility breeds crusade, and that resistance without imagination breeds exactly the tyrant it fears. For had the High Lords fashioned a homecoming she could inhabit without renouncing the fierce religion that had kept her alive, perhaps the wheel would have broken by consent rather than by conflagration. But lords replay histories to console themselves, and breakers of wheels are poor at compromise, and between those two cities burn. If there is solace to be gathered, it is that the last act, terrible as it was, exposed the Iron Throne as a fetish rather than a foundation. The dragon's breath made a puddle of a century's brutal aspirations, and in the steaming pool the survivors glimpsed, perhaps for the first time, the possibility that rulership might be refashioned to include the maimed, the quiet, the weavers and listeners. The choice of a king who could not father a dynasty was not an accident but an attempt to remove from the realm the temptation to let blood and fire masquerade as law again. In that settlement, Daenerys has a place. Not as the monster in a cautionary tale, but as a sign that zeal in the service of the downtrodden can collapse into the very cruelty it detests when it ceases to recognize persons as more than spokes in a mill of history. She deserves, then, a verdict braided of praise and condemnation, of pity and warning. Praise for the way her presence compelled a continent to remember that the weak are not resigned to their chains. Condemnation for the day she turned that remembrance into a furnace. Pity for the child who never learned another means to articulate justice except immolation and fear. Warning for the generations to come that dragons exist in many forms, and that the habit of shaping the world by terror is as available to good intentions as to bad. Between the storm at her birth and the snow of her ruin, Daenerys Targaryen walked a path that made slave citizens and citizens cinders. If that is madness, it is a madness the world teaches as often as it inherits it, and if that is sovereignty, it is sovereignty the world must learn to outgrow. Whether she deserved her end is a poorer question than whether we deserved her beginning, and whether, having survived her, we shall build a peace no longer in love with purity's flame. Yet the quarrel with questions does not absolve us of answers, and so I set down the final line. The realm was right to stop her hand, and wrong to have no better gift to offer a woman who had taught it again to hate its chains than a knife in a lover's arms. The rest is instruction, for queens to temper promise with patience, for councils to knit welcome out of fear, for peoples to judge reforms by the faces they preserve as well as the idols they shatter, so that the next time bells speak surrender the sky may answer with silence, and the long smoke that marks the end of an age may be incense for a coronation rather than the breath of a dragon that loved too fiercely an idea of freedom and not enough the fragile breathing world. Yet if the ledger is to be closed with honesty, one must keep turning its pages until the ink of comparison darkens the fingertips. For a single reign cannot be measured in a vacuum, but only against neighbors and ancestors whose names still heat the tongues of bards and judges. Thus do we set Daenerys beside Aegon, who made lords bend with dragonfire and then, having proven the impossibility of resistance, largely put aside the privilege of annihilation and wore law like a second skin. Beside Maegor, who used flame and iron as a vocabulary for fear and died pierced upon a throne that punished and judged him at once. Beside Jaehaerys, who saw that the splendor of crowns is a poor substitute for the quiet labor of roads, hand-fasting, and grain. Beside Baelor, whose holiness starved governance. Beside Visenya and Rhaenys, whose tempers and affections braided conquest with conciliation. Beside Ares, who believed that fire could rewrite reality and whose madness was not a sudden flare but a slow eclipse of every light that counsel and affection lit. And beside these, we array the great non-dragon kings and queens of nearer memory. Tywin, who was never a king but understood kingship as cold arithmetic and proved that terror can be rendered in ledgers and letters as easily as in flames. Cersei, who enthroned herself on the ruins of her children and contrived a spectacular of green fire to make the city forget that a crown without allies is a beehive without bees. Stannis, whose stern devotion to law ended, as zeal so often does, with a pyre for his own heart. Robb Stark, who mistook fidelity and love for fidelity and strategy and paid the price that love-struck generals always pay. And Eddard, who confused the ritual proprieties of honor with the living musculature of survival, dignifying truth but leaving behind a chaos measured in orphans' eyes. In such a gallery, Daenerys is neither monster unique nor martyr pure. She is a type as old as thrones. The Redeemer who believes that what resists redemption is a kind of villainy deserving not argument but erasure, and the particular instruments she wielded were dragons, which make erasure swift and theatrical, whereas others of her kind have used coins and parchments, prisons and ravens, to draw long slow circles around those they deem obstacles. There is a temptation among apologists to round the sharp edges of the sack of kings landing by invoking precedent, and it must be admitted that precedent exists. Aegon torched the Harrenhal monstrosity without grief. Lord Tywin permitted and rewarded a sack of that same city when the door was opened. The North has known burned villages as a tactic under Boltons and Ironborn alike, and even the Faith, whose sermons will be used against Daenerys in centuries to come, has sung hymns loudly enough to drown the crackle of fires built for heretics. Yet to confess precedent is not to absolve, for what renders her deed singular is not the presence of flame but the rejection of proportion, the execution of a symbol as if the symbol were an army, the transformation of a capitulation into a constitutive act of founding, as though the mute debris of a capital might be reforged into a more obedient people. In the philosophy of kingship there are three roads by which obedience is sought. The ancient one of custom that lulls acquiescence by telling a people that the shape of their days is as inevitable as weather, the middling one of reason that persuades or at least consults before commanding, and the sharp one of fear that makes obedience the easy alternative to pain. Daenerys had trod all three at times but came under the pressure of bereavement and betrayal and the narcotic of unanswerable strength to prefer the third as not only the most effective but the most morally clarifying, as though fear were a solvent that strips away hypocrisy and reveals essences. Here lies the hinge on which verdicts swing. Whether a sovereign who has convinced herself that terror is a kind of accelerated pedagogy deserves to be treated as a madwoman whose knife must be wrested from her, or as a tragic reformer who must be checked but not reduced to a puppet of inherited prophecy. For madness is a category that absolves the world of complicity while tragedy indicts it, and histories prefer absolution to indictment because absolution permits continuity with minimal reform. Attend, then, to the chain of proximate causes that led sky and street to exchange their roles, the one stooping, the other blazing. Varys, who fancied himself the realm in human form and had long measured queens and kings as a baker measures loaves, coolly began to write the letters that would unmake his sworn sovereign because a rival claim, strong in blood, weak in desire, had presented him with a tool he trusted more than conscience. Tyrion, whose mind is a cabinet of delicate instruments, easily damaged by guilt, spent his affection like coin on the illusion that his sister could be reached by the arithmetic of survival, and by doing so cost Daenerys not only time but the protective veil of inevitability which her enemies had previously feared. Jon, whose decency is a kind of ice that cools every room he enters, carried within him a name that functioned as a spell in ears trained to bow to lineage, and though he neither sought nor exploited that magic, he could not make it stop. Working in others, and its working drew Daenerys into a new geometry in which every counsel and caress might be treachery in disguise. Euron's bolts snapped a dragon from the air, and the death of a child. Let the historian avoid coyness, for dragons are children to dragon riders, not pets. Carves channels in the mind where the river of consolation cannot flow. Missandei's last word, spoken with her neck bare to an executioner who represented the city Daenerys had sworn to unseat, was not merely acute a rage but a distillation of years of doctrine into a single syllable which had always meant both destruction and execution of justice. And so when the bells rang, they rang through a mind in which mercy had been disciplined too often into delay, and delay had tended to cost the lives of those who had trusted her. I write not to excuse but to trace the anatomy of a decision, because without anatomy verdicts become fables, and fables teach children less than they terrify them. And the anatomy teaches this, that the queen entered the city not merely to win a war but to perform a demonstration for the future, and demonstrations of that kind use dreadful means because they aspire to be final, after which, so the argument runs, the gentler instruments may serve without the perpetual necessity of sharpening. Could she have done otherwise? Did she, in the vocabulary of the Septons, possess the freedom to stand her dragon down when the clangor ceased? Would another sovereign, feeling as she felt and trained as she was trained, have chosen a different proof? These are questions better suited to the poets, and yet the historian may risk a reply. Yes, she could have done otherwise, because the world witnesses rulers choosing otherwise under similar provocations, and the existence of counterexample is enough to refute fatalism. And yet, no, many would not have done otherwise, because the combination of private wound, public mission, and unmatched instrument is a recipe that has burned cities before and will burn them again wherever a people survives under a sky that yields such creatures. When she fell to Jon's blade, with a hope spoken on her lips that sounded like a child describing a meadow never seen, the act that ended her life had two faces, one turned to the law and one to love. The law's face is impersonal and says that a sovereign who renews violence against surrendered subjects is a rebel against the order she claims to inaugurate and may be halted by any loyal hand. Love's face is angular and says that to spare her further guilt was a kindness disguised as betrayal, since her path had narrowed to a corridor in which each step would require a new abomination to justify the last. If mercy often appears as lenience, sometimes it appears as stoppage, and the two can be as indistinguishable at first glance as twins in a cradle. Drogon's Elegy. If ever a creature sang a lyric unheard by human ears, it was when the beast melted the throne that had given form to a century of appetites, and the subsequent choosing of Bran, whose body had been broken be. Why a fall that stands as allegory for the fall of unexamined inheritance are commonly cited as the realm's answer, and perhaps they are, but answers can be correct and yet insufficient. For the Iron Throne's liquefaction punished the idol while leaving the worship intact, and the election of a sovereign who cannot sire a line addresses the symptom of dynastic complacency without curing the disease of power's glamour. In the years that follow, future courts will conjure Daenerys as omen whenever a reformer's voice grows too loud. Small men will throw her shade upon generous designs to keep those designs small. Likewise, those who dream in banners will clutch her name as shield against any censure of severe remedies. Both uses are profanations, but history is a marketplace where names become coin. To guard against such counterfeit, we must remember the specific grain of her virtues as well as the weight of her crimes. She placed herself between whip and back across the sea and learned the opinions of the poor not by sending for them but by living among them. She punished traitors in her ranks with a steadiness that made her armies less frightful to the free than to the cruel. She listened, when she could endure to listen, to a counsel that told her the unflattering truth, and not every sovereign can bear to hear it. She attempted, at cost to her own ardor, to accept local custom where that custom could be laundered of its worst toxins. She held loyalty in higher esteem than flattery. These are not small virtues, and none of them prevented her catastrophe, which is the most sobering thing a student of rule can learn. Some will argue that the coin had landed cursed side up at birth, and that her end was therefore written in hair and bone. This is the comfort of determinists and the shrug of the lazy. The blood of the dragon is a proverb because patterns repeat, not because fluids command. What repeats is not insanity as a substance but a style of choosing made enticing by a family's mythology, and the mythology whispers that greatness is a flame that grows pure by feeding upon what pollutes it. To refuse the whisper is possible, as J. Harry's proved, but it requires a childhood with teachers who prize the slow virtues, and Daenerys had a childhood in which flight was the only pedagogy and indignity the only tutor. There are also those who will insist that if the lords had greeted her with the warmth they reserved for a stark smile, she might have governed with an open hand. This too is a half-truth, for welcome would have cooled suspicion and softened the need for spectacle. But even a welcomed redeemer must learn to transpose liberation into law, and the task would have asked of her a renunciation that her story had not prepared her to grant. A renunciation of exemplarity, of the need to make a moral portrait out of every judgment. The old gods, whose faces in the trees neither grin nor frown, may render a different verdict than the seven, whose static icons force even the glowing of candles into a ritual symmetry. The red god, whose priests speak of cleansing fires, might acquit her with a tear. But none of these divine assemblies, however desperately invoked by litigants, will spare the living the obligation to build arrangements that do not test the souls of strong women to destruction. Let us listen, as the years proceed, for the testimony of the ones whose voices were ignored in the Day of Dragons. The freedman in Meereen who saw his daughter become a midwife because a queen tore down a city's cruel towers and then left it to muddle toward peace. The shepherd on the Blackwater who never dreamed of politics until he ran with a wet cloth over his child's face, whose living account rebukes moralists who tidy the horror with pretty nouns. The Dothraki Iraq-bearer who learned, to his bewilderment, that a woman can command and that command is not theft but a form of belonging. The unsullied captain who discovered in obedience a paradoxical liberty because the orders he received aligned, at last, with the inner whisper that had always praised dignity. The scribe in Old Town who finds in her career a parable to use against smooth-voiced merchants of the possible, and in her ruin a parable to use against smooth-voiced merchants of the pure. Their voices do not converge upon a single sentence, but they insist on a single discipline. That we speak of her in sentences large enough to hold contradiction without breaking. When children ask why the dragon's wings darkened the sun and why the sun did not darken the dragon back, we will tell them that power, when it believes itself a physician ordained to set bones and cauterize wounds, must appoint to itself friends who are brave enough to cry out when healthy flesh is being cut, and that Daenerys, whose friends dwindled by death and defection, stood at last in a closeted chamber of her own convictions, with only the echo of her intentions to answer her. Then we will tell them that the realm, grown complacent in its appetite for spectacle and punishment, had made a theater of politics from which a woman of her temperature could hardly exit as a quiet reformer. Finally, we will tell them that the throne's destruction was a necessary image but not a sufficient reform, for kingship, deprived of its iron icon, will find new furniture unless the people consent to become participants in their own keeping rather than spectators of designated saviors. As for whether she deserved the epithet that attached to her like burrs to a cloak, I repeat with sorrow that the name was a shield for the city's sanity, not a scalpel for history, and while I will not contest the citizens' prerogative to pronounce that name in grief, I will urge the schools to teach an older grammar. That righteous fury can be prudent and fervent mercy can be cruel, that motives earn neither immunity nor damnation but only scrutiny, that ends sit in judgment upon means and means name the kind of RLDNs are capable of building when at last they arrive. Under such a grammar, the end of Daenerys Targaryen is both deserved and lamentable, necessary and preventable, and the task she bequeathed is not the worship of restraint as an idol but the cultivation of those institutional and domestic habits that make restraint second nature. I hold that if the gods give the realm another liberator, we should be so wise as to make room for her in our councils before she learns to govern with fire alone, to give her rituals that can absorb her urgency without teaching her that delay is surrender, to give her companions who will risk their standing to contradict her when her clarity turns to vengeance and who will not betray her when their warnings are unheeded, to give her enemies small enough to satisfy justice without destroying the floorboards beneath the nursery, to give her a past that is not all insult and a future that is not all ordeal. For the lesson of Daenerys is this and no other, that the straightest road to tyranny may be walked by feet that set out toward freedom, that the sky is made kinder not by forbidding dragons' birth but by teaching their riders to love what cannot be remade by heat, and that the only throne a realm can trust forever is the one that dissolves day by day into the work and rest of ordinary lives, work which needs no queen to sanctify it, rest which no queen should dare to interrupt.